Alrighty, so today's video is going to be an aspect alignment deep dive. I'll be covering all the aspects in the game combined with the heroism and villainy alignments. I'll be talking about the pros of each of these color combinations, the weaknesses. I'll be giving them a nice tidy grade at the end. There'll be some card callouts, and the idea here is to kind of give you a breakdown of how to deck build with these colors, right? Each aspect in this game has strengths and weaknesses. It's even further emphasized once you look into the alignments, right? Things like Vigilance villainy is very different than Vigilance heroism. This should give you an idea of how to start deck building and what to look at in terms of combining these aspects with other colors to shore up weaknesses, and how to really dig into the strengths that these colors have. Before we get going, please click that subscribe button. It helps out a ton. Feel free to check out my Patreon as well. It's pretty new. It features a lot of deck lists, has a free and subscriber tier on it. All right, so we're going to get started with Vigilance villainy. So this is one of my favorites. This is the control color combo in the game, right? Blue-black, Vigilance villainy, typically or almost exclusively has to be built as a control deck because a lot of the cards in it are purely meant for those kinds of archetypes. The color itself features powerful removal, things like Power of the Dark Side, but also the unit-based removal, things like Snoke, Avenger, Death Trooper even. It has a very potent late game, right? We talked about Avenger. It's got Snoke. It has bombs all the way up at the top of the chain. And it's got early defensive units like Sentinels, Pike Sentinel, Lieutenant Childson. A card like the Client has some built-in defensive natures with its healing, right? So typically a deck like this needs the game to go long. It's not going to be able to beat you very early, at least not with most of its power cards. Part of the cons for this color is that the early game units aren't very powerful. They're defensive, but they're statted pretty weakly most of the time. They don't often trade one for one with aggressive units that come out, which means that you need to shore up your early game elsewhere, right? And a lot of that is with removal, but often it's combined with other colors. Additionally, it doesn't have much of a closing speed to it. It basically needs to take control of the game in most senses and then just kind of hit your opponent with the units that are in play, right? Avenger can close a game out pretty quickly, but it is still just one unit. And most of the time, you are not able to burst your opponent out from nowhere. You need to kind of like build towards that 25 or 30 damage. And it is a little bit on the slower end when it comes to that. And finally, space is a pretty big weakness in this color. Until you get to something like Avenger, you do not have very many good space units, right? Inferno 4 is a good unit, but is not a good like defensive unit in terms of fighting off a space assault. Clan Sax and Gauntlet didn't quite get there as a good mid-game Sentinel because it's statted too poorly. So in general, space is a pretty big liability here. But overall, this color is a pillar of some of the best decks in the format. It combined with the neutral blue cards, which feature even more removal and healing. Things like Make an Opening and Vigilance are really important to kind of shore up your early game, right? That healing helps undo a lot of what happens early on. So combined with that neutral stuff, and then other colors usually to help shore up some other weaknesses, this becomes certainly one of the more potent aspect alignment combinations. So my grade for it is a hefty A-. It is not all the way at the top, mostly because of some of the weaknesses and because I feel like it needs to really get a friend to combine with it, another color to kind of fix some of the problems, and it does sometimes have issues with early game board states. All right, next up is Vigilance heroism. So there are some similarities in terms of what the main gist of what they're doing, right? This is also a color that aims to stall early, right? It doesn't. I'll start with the cons here. The closing speed is probably even worse than the villainy version. They do not have very potent damage dealing cards in this color. It's hard for this color to catch up. It doesn't have very many ways to like escalate if it loses tempo on the board. It's a color that has notoriously been pretty weak into tempo-based decks like Boba that have a bunch of bounce, because all this deck usually does early in the game is play one unit at a time, and if it falls behind too much, it's hard for it to catch up. Luke is basically the first time it can really throw down an efficient 2-for-1 that like removes something big, presents a big threat, and then also adds healing. So it is their best way of catching back up into games. But the pros here, first of all, restoring healing is all over the place. The units themselves, like Yoda, Kanan, Luke, they just have healing, right? It's all over the place. Some of their leaders have it, like Rey. On top of that, defensive units, they have sentinels. So like village protectors is one of the most annoying sentinels in the game. You've got Obi-Wan. It stalls pretty well as long as it doesn't fall too far behind board. On top of that, it is uniquely situated as the primary force synergy color in heroism. Almost all the force units and like basically all the good force units are in this color. So if you want to turn on force synergy, you basically have to play blue hero. Although some of the payoffs like force throw are in red. To turn any of it on, you really need the early game units that this color provides. And it also has leaders like Chirrut and Rey that are force. So that is definitely a pro for this because some of the force synergies are incredibly powerful. So all in all, I don't think this is really as much of like a deep control color as villainy, although it does tend to skew more controlling because, again, the closing speed is low. A lot of the good units themselves are more defensive in nature with healing. Their stats tend to be more defensive. So it does lend itself into a less aggressive and more controlling archetype. My grade for it is a B+. I think it is a very good color. It's a little bit lower for me than the villainy version, mainly because I don't think the top end really matches what the villainy version can provide. But still a very high grade for me. All right. Next up is Command Villainy. So, I like blue-green, so there's definitely going to be some bias here. But Command Villainy is very uniquely situated as it is by far the best ramp color in the game because Super Laser Tech is one of the best cards in the game. And although the heroes do get to ramp now and have their own ramp card in Spark of Hope, it does not really match Super Laser Tech. And it also doesn't really match what the green villains can do at the top end. So once you start getting into cards like Vader and then going even further up into the big Star Destroyers and also Maul now with the second set. So the late game is tremendous. The catch-up mechanics, this is very important because it's not this catch-up mechanic thing, especially for slower colors. We just talked about one, like both the blue ones, Hero and Villainy, Vigilance. They sometimes struggle with catching up if they're too far behind. Well, Command Villainy has a card called Overwhelming Barrage, which is one of the best catch-up mechanics in the game. It is what allows these decks to do things like ramp early and fall behind on board. It's incredibly important, incredibly potent, a very core piece to the puzzle here. So they've got ramp. They are solidified as ramp. Ramp is one of the most powerful mechanics in this game because of how it works with leaders. Leaders are free when you deploy them. So ramping isn't punished as much as it could be because you get a free action once you hit that leader threshold, right? You are paying resources to do something bigger later, but that bigger thing later is also accompanied with a free leader deploy, and you're doing that before your opponent. Some cons. Early game units. Again, this is kind of a trend in general with villainy. They do not have very many good early units. It is sometimes a bit of a problem. Space, I would say, is by far the biggest weakness for this color. It is a big reason I do not love mono green right now, because the space is absolutely horrific. I struggle even thinking of good space units to put in decks when I'm making a mono green deck, and it's a really big problem, especially because all their removal is also damage based, so you have a really tough time dealing with anything with the shield, and something in space with the shield is even more of a nightmare, or like something like a lurking tie phantom, right? These decks really struggle with that. They have to play usually things like Consortium Star Viper, Black Sun, which is an okay Space Sentinel in the neutral villainy aspect. Basically space. This might be the weakest space color in the game, and it's a big problem when a lot of decks feature important space units. And finally, restore healing. Now, a lot of decks don't have this, but I want to specifically call it out here. It's an issue because of how important it is in this color. This is a go long color. It's a ramp color. It's playing for a late game, which is why it helps to have restore. It's also why it helps pairing this with a color that has restore, which is villainy blue, right? Blue-green villain is a pretty important staple in the current metagame. It's a pretty important staple in the first set's metagame. Doesn't seem to really be going away. Now, all said and done, I am giving this color an A simply because of how powerful the individual cards are. Super Laser Tech, Darth Vader, Overwhelming Barrage. These are still three of the most powerful cards in this game. The top end can't be matched by any other color. Even the bridge units like Maul and Vader are better than most other 7-drops in the game. So if you are able to shore up some of these weaknesses that we talked about, right? Your early game, your space, and your restore and healing, you have yourself an absolute powerhouse of a color. All right, next will be Command Heroism. So, all right, as with the villainy version, late game is pretty good here. It's not as potent because they don't really go bigger than Home 1. Home 1 is very good, but it does not match up with things like Avenger, Devastator, Relentless that come out of the villainy late games. But Ewing and Home 1 are pretty potent top end, and they're certainly very grindy cards, and this color does lend itself into like a slightly different version of a late game, an attrition-based one, because of how good it is grinding with those cards. It has good defensive units, things that restore, some Sentinels like Bright Hope, very, very good. Sundari Peacekeeper, good early game unit. Battlefield Marine can be an aggressive unit, can also be a defensive unit, right? Because it's just so well statted in the early game. You've got things like Akbar to help clean up stuff. Definitely has more healing than the villainy version. With like the Peacekeeper, Home 1, Akbar has built-in restore. Like these units can do some chip healing. And it has ramp, right? It actually has the same amount of ramp as the villainy version now that we have Spark of Hope. But Spark of Hope is not as good as Super Laser Tech, and the payoffs in this color are not as good. In fact, part of the issue here is that the 5-drop slot is pretty weak in this color, which means ramping on turn 2 with something like Resupply or even Spark of Hope is less potent than it would be when you have better 5-drops, which I believe the villainy version does until you start adding other colors into your Command Heroism deck. The 5s here aren't very good. On top of that, it doesn't really have a big 7, which is also an important threshold with these ramp colors, right? In villainy, we talked about Vader and Maul, but other colors have their big 7s too. We just passed the blue color, has Luke in Hero, it has Count Dooku in villainy. There's not really a big 7 to go with here, so again, you need to pair it with another color, but that still means you're probably only having a handful of big ramp targets. So essentially the ramp hasn't felt nearly as consistent, partially because Spark of Hope is not as reliable as Super Laser Tech, but also because the actual things you're ramping into don't seem to flip the board as well. The color also has big issues with catch-up mechanics, same as the hero blue. It's a very like chunky color. Usually it's like 1 unit a turn style. It's an issue. I think blue green hero in general has always had that issue because neither of those colors really complement each other in terms of like catching up. It's been a notoriously incredibly weak color combo into tempo like mono yellow decks because of that. It does not have really any good removal. Again, that goes kind of hand in hand with the catch-up mechanic stuff. You're not removing much, like it has to come from your units. And additionally, the reach closing speed, it's similar to like the villain blue in that sense. Like you're just trying to outvalue and then like finish the game off with some attacks, but like it doesn't burst, it doesn't really cheat damage, and it's a little clunky in that sense. All in all, there are some really good stuff in this color. I think especially like the Ewing Home 1 stuff is a very good way for heroes to fight into control archetypes, but it's not enough. Typically, it has to be paired with stuff like tech as well, and often either with aggressive stuff from other decks or discard mechanics from other decks to really be able to outgrind villainy top ends. I am not very high on this color. I give it a C+. It's one of the lower grades I have. It's not really featured right now in top decks, in my opinion. But, well, excuse me. It is in Sabine, but basically a Sabine deck is just playing green because of Energy Conversion Lab. And, you know, it plays like Battlefield Marine, but it is a very light green. It's not, it's very much an ancillary color in that deck, and the most important card in that deck happens to be a neutral green card, and we are talking about Command Heroism here. All right, next up is Aggression Villainy. So this is a weird one. I think Prose is pretty easily, you can say space. It's probably, it's definitely Villainy best space color. It has Punishing One, has Ruthless Raider, has Kylo's Tie, it has Imperial Interceptor. It has good space units. Additionally, it's kind of like the only color that has very good bounty synergy. Like there are a little bit in some other colors, like the yellow has the Haxion 4/3 guy, and green has the Reputable Hunter. But basically, if you want to play put any kind of investment into bounties in your deck, this kind of has to be the color, because it's where you're getting things like Django, who's a significant payoff, like probably the best payoff for playing bounties. You get some decent bounties too with Guild Target and Death Mark to like supplement. Those are obviously neutral, but you got Chrysanthemum too. He is a bounty synergy unit if you're looking to really dig into that. But and like Bosk, right? Bosk is in red, and he is kind of the bounty synergy. It also is the Force synergy color. Now, this is like a pro, but sort of, because I don't think the Force synergy enablers in Villainy are particularly powerful. They're certainly way less consistent, and they're less plentiful than the Hero Blue stuff. You've got Fifth Brother, you got Seventh Sister as like the only decent earlier units, and I'm not even high on either of those units. The only leader that can do Force stuff early is Kylo, and he's pretty fragile. So while this is the color to dig into for Force synergy, it is not nearly as potent than Heroes when it comes to that. Oh, and one more good card with the bounty synergy is Punishing One, right? That's another incredibly important card for bounty synergy. I know it's not directly related to bounties, but it's the best way to trigger that Punishing One repeatedly. All right, cons. Early game units. So it doesn't have very many outside of like the space stuff that we talked about. Its ground game especially is pretty poor early game. It makes playing mono red villain pretty difficult in that sense because the early units are very fragile or just weakly statted. On top of that, their defensive units aren't very good. They tend to be much more skewed into like space, right? Like space is where all the good units are, and then like on the ground, you don't have sentinels, you don't have healing. You don't really put up much of a defensive front there. And also late game isn't very good, interestingly enough. So like Ruthless Raider is good, but that's I wouldn't call that late game. Palpatine is a pretty good unit, but again, he is kind of a bridge card. This color doesn't really have like hammers at the end, and it makes like grinding with it, especially as a primary color, not that effective. Overall, what I look to do for in this color right now is usually ancillary. I think Ruthless Raider is one of the best cards into control in general. So often we'll play a red splash just to get Ruthless Raider into the deck. It is still like the color red is still the color has like neutral discard effects. Now they're not specifically towards aggression villainy, but they're there for you to kind of dig into. And the early game space, right, is powerful. The problem is it's not a very, outside of like having a couple good early space units, it's not a very aggressive color. And those units tend to be pretty aggressive in nature. So it's like, are you using them for defense, which is not ideal, but are you using them for offense? Well, the rest of the deck is having a hard time doing the offense stuff. So this color, in my opinion, is has the least identity of any color right now. I think you can do some good stuff specifically with Bosk and red because of the bounty synergy stuff. I think those are important. I think other than that, it's mostly a splash color to get a better space presence into your deck, and especially something like Ruthless Raider for anti-control. I give this color a C. It's the lowest grade I have. I do think it's the weakest color in terms of like a primary aspect combination in this game currently. All right, aggression, heroism. So, pros. It's got a lot of them. Early game units has some of the best early game stuff in the game. A-Wing, Sabine are some of the two best 2-drops in the game. I would call even things like K2, Poe, and Wrecker early game-ish, especially if like that's the top of your curve. Now, Wrecker is an absolute monster of a card. The space in this deck is pretty good because of A-Wing, like kind of carrying the load there, but also red 3. The reach and closing speed is unmatched. It is the best burn color in the game, having direct damage from hand, like for a cause I believe in, but like Wrecker as well is basically reach. K2 is reach. Cassian from your resource row is reach. This color is the definition of closing speed and reach. It is not only aggressive and dealing damage early, but it can do damage even once it has been controlled out of the game, and it's what makes it so potent. On top of that, discard. So although a lot of discard stuff is in red neutral, I think what makes red so potent with the discard strategy is it gets the addition of something like K2, which is a very good unit into control decks, kind of regardless of which half of it you're doing. And then Poe has incidental discard built into it. And on top of that, Force Throw, although not being a red hero card specifically, it kind of is in a lot of ways because the best enablers for it under heroism, right? They're in blue, but the blue-red discard package is powerful in part because Force Throw is so easily enabled in that deck. So discard is another pro here. So what are some cons? Like the late game, like the really late game, right? Like if you do get controlled and you are not in a position where like top decking a Wrecker or For a Cause are going to win you the game, you may end up just having games slip away from you. There's not much in terms of a top end curve here. Now, this was fixed slightly with the addition of Crate Dragon into the game. It didn't give red, both hero and villain, an actual target for like late stuff. But the aggression heroism, as far as like its own identity, does not really have good late game units. Even Mace Windu I'm pretty low on, but he's also not really a late game unit. He's kind of a bridge card like most of the 7 cost units. Defensive units, they're like non-existent here. It's not the point of this color. This is basically the way villain blue is the control color. This is the aggro color. It can be used in a more mid-rangey control-y shell purely because of the discard aspect, if that's what you're digging into. But it is very much as a primary color digging into aggression. The grade here is an A. I think it's the only other A I have. This in green villainy. This color for 2 sets now has kind of set the tone and the agenda of the game, right? Like, if you can't beat the red aggro hero decks consistently or beat everything else and only lose to it, then you're probably not in a good spot. Okay, last color. So we're on Cunning Villainy. Now, Cunning Villainy and Cunning Heroism actually have very similar lists of pros and cons. So their early game is potent. Here they have pretty good space units. 7th Fleet Defender, Cartel Spacer, Lurking Tie are all like fairly good early space units. They have like Evazin, which is a pretty powerful early game unit with a major downside, of course. There's stuff like Forlom Zuckuss to kind of like help with your early game. Boba Fett unit is one of the most busted 3-drops. It is just a good early game color. It also is kind of the tempo color. Now, a lot of that comes from neutral aspect Cunning, like Waylay, Cantina Bouncer, Cunning. Those are like the definition of tempo, right? They are things that are technically just putting you ahead on board at the cost of resources and temporarily, right? That's kind of where tempo in my mind is what I think of. It's temporary, although it's not temporary if you kill your opponent before your opponent's ever able to like redeploy everything or ready all their stuff that was exhausted, like with no good to me dead. So this is the premium tempo color. It's made even more premium by Boba Fett leader's ability, right? Like all these tempo cards costing less, letting you not only bounce something with Waylay, but then also play a unit on the same turn. That's how you get ahead, right? If you just bounce and pass, not much is happening. But if you bounce and play a unit, or if you know good to me, kill something, ready resources, play another unit, and you just end up snowballing, then you're doing it good, right? And that's where Boba comes in. It's a bit hard to rate this color without talking about Boba because he is kind of the epitome of Cunning Villainy right now. He defines the color. I did not put Fett's Fire Spray up here. It would change the grade that I will give this in the end. I tried to be a little more neutral in how I'm talking about this, and Fett's Fire Spray is not really a Cunning Villainy card. It's a Cunning Boba card. But it does kind of loom over here in terms of like how good this color is. If you want to include it, then you're also kind of excluding all the other Cunning Villainy leaders. Some cons, the late game, right? This is another color that if it like falls behind, it's going to have a hard time catching up. All its like interaction is temporary. It's either with exhaust or bounce, so it's not something that's great at coming back once it's been controlled. In that same sense, like the catch-up mechanic, right? It's not able to come back from bad board states because when you're behind, your Cunnings are way worse, your Waylays are way worse, your units that are pretty good early on tend to be outclassed later. There's also basically no removal in this color. I mean, like Shoot First in the neutral is like kind of removal. You've got Frozen and Carbonite in the villain is actually like is hard removal, but it is a big weak on that front. All right, my grade for this is a B+. This would be an A- if I was like saying Boba Cunning instead of Cunning Villainy, because Fett's Fire Spray definitely just kind of bumps this an entire grade. But it's still a very powerful color and has some of the most annoying units in the game. and Cunning heroism. So the pros here are pretty similar, and the cons. In fact, I think I only changed one thing on this list. It was replacing tempo from the villain version for discard in the hero version. Of course, the tempo stuff still exists from the neutral aspect. Villainy just kind of digs into that a little more. But Cunning heroism has probably the best discard card in the game, which is Spark of Rebellion. It also obviously has a good space game. It's got Millennium Falcon. It's got the Cartel Turncoat as early game space units that are pretty efficient. It's got the Liberator Gunship as an early game ambush space unit. It has the Big Falcon. So it is a pretty good space color. In fact, paired with Red Hero makes one of the more powerful space decks. It's kind of the basis of the Sabine Yellow, which was definitely more powerful in set 1 than it is in set 2, but still has still presents a problem that a lot of decks can't answer. Again, the early game, because of all that space, is powerful. The early game ground units, not as good, but they also do have like something like Kira on the ground, which is another, it's on discard, but it is hand hate. On top of that, the late game, not so great either in this color. It does tend to be a little bigger than the villain version because Han Solo is a kind of a bomb, but he's not really undoing any things that happen in the 8, 9, 10 range. So he is kind of a top end for a mid range and not so much a late game. The same way that the villain Cunning version will struggle with catching up, it's true here as well. Your interaction is tempo based. Your units tend to be outclassed later in the game, so you need to prevent yourself from falling behind, which is what the tempo is for. It's what the discard is for. And removal, right? So removal in this color is discard. It's not really anywhere else. These colors both do have a lot of reach when it comes to closing games. All of that is basically coming from the neutral aspect when it like Surprise Strike and Cunning, but direct removal, not so much happening over here. So I give this one a B-. I think this is more of a support color. Now, I know one of the more premium decks, or at least one of the more played decks right now, is a mono yellow hero deck with the Han. I do have my reservations as how long that's going to last. I think it's trying to do mostly what a Boba yellow deck does, giving up a lot of the like oomph that deck has and replacing it with discard and some DJ tech stuff, right? Like to hopefully steal games that way. But I think overall the hero yellow lends itself more to support, whereas the villain yellow can be more of a primary color in general. All right, so just briefly, main differences that I want to identify between villain and hero when it comes to just like their alignments. So the villains, late game, right? They just do have a better late game than the heroes. Nothing really matches the capital ships in terms of that. It's just Crate Dragon in the neutral red when it comes to like a giant thing. The hero endgame loops require attrition much more because they need to just be able to like outdo the card advantage that the villains are getting from their giant capital ships through sheer like card advantage. Things like Home 1 come into mind and U-Wing or discard. But the late game and villain is frankly just more powerful, more potent, and it gets there quicker because the ramp is better. In contrast, the heroes' early game is significantly better. Their early game units trump villains basically everywhere outside of like the Cunning villainy stuff, which has a good space presence and shielded units all over the place. But overall, the hero early game tends to be better. Villains, removal. So they do just have better removal, whether it comes attached to units or just cards themselves, but Barrage and Power of the Dark Side are unmatched when it comes to the hero versions. And then they also have like their units that create giant removal swings like Snoke, Avenger, even like things like Vader and Maul. In contrast, the hero version of removal, it does discard much better, and we talked about that in the red section. Although a lot of the discard cards are in neutral aspect, the real kicker here is definitely things like K2 and Poe, Spark of Rebellion, and then also just Force Throw being a much better card in Heroes because of the Force enabling. So the discard strategy works much better in Hero because something I say a lot about discard is that it doesn't really matter until you get the last card, because the last card's always the best card. And you need a certain critical mass of discard for it to really matter. If you just throw pillages in your villain decks, it doesn't really do anything. It needs to be combined with other stuff. And Heroes just have a much easier time doing that because a lot of cards that would just be main deck cards anyway are there, like K2 and Force Throw and Poe, right? Like these cards that do the discard, but also would just be good even if you weren't in a discard plan. That's what makes Heroes so much better at the discard plan. Villains, ramp, talked about this. It's not so much the aggregate amount of ramp, because of course they can actually play the same amount right now. It's just that Super Laser Tech is way better than any ramp card in Heroes, and the villains just have better ramp targets than Heroes. And their leaders also lend themselves a little smoother into the ramp plan. Heroes have better restore and healing. Now, of course, villains get the neutral stuff like Vigilance and Make an Opening, and they do have the Client, but Heroes just have a lot of built-in restore on their units that are already good. We talked about Yoda and Kanan and Luke, Sendari Peacekeeper, Akbar, Home One. Some leaders like Rey have it. So overall, the healing is just better in Heroes. It comes more incidentally for them. They don't have to try as hard to get restore. And lastly, kind of token stuff. So bounties are just better in villain. It's almost exclusively because of Bosk himself being the bounty leader. But the units, most of the payoff units for bounties happen to be in villain as well, like the Haxion unit, Django and Chrysanthemum, Punishing One. And in contrast, Heroes do Force much better because their units are much better. The Force units are just better, and the Force leaders are cheaper or better also. I find it very hard to really dig into a Force package in villain, and it's pretty easy to do it in Hero. As far as actual like Force payoffs, they're kind of equal. They both have two, right? So villains have Force Lightning, and villains have Palpatine's Return. Now, Palpatine's Return is not so much a Force payoff, though. It's just like a good card. Heroes have One with the Force, which I think is incredibly powerful, and they have the less played Mystic Reflection. But the real winner in terms of Force payoffs is obviously Force Throw. I think Forces with me is probably the second best one, but it really comes out to the enablers and them being so much more consistent in the hero decks. All right, threw all the grades out right here. So final grades: Vigilance Villainy A-, Vigilance Heroism B+, Command Villainy was an A, Command Heroism was a C+, Aggression Villainy was a C, Aggression Heroism an A, Cunning Villainy B+, but you include Fett's Fire Spray, I probably would just make it an A-, and then Cunning Heroism B-. So as you can see, my top two colors are Command Villainy and Aggression Heroism. It's I think plays out pretty much like that currently in terms of like the meta. Some of the best decks feature these colors, and we will see where we go from here and what happens with the next colors, with the next set in terms of like how these color shifts may change and whether we'll be able to make more hard controlling hero decks and more aggressive villainy decks. All right, hope you enjoyed this one. Again, if you haven't yet, please subscribe, like the video, and until next time, take care.